All right, everyone, I think we're gonna go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, folks. My name is Veronica Buckwalter. I am co-project director for the National Student Attendance Engagement and Success Center. Welcome to today's webinar focused on intervention reviews. Before we begin, I'm going to share some brief details about today's webinar, which will last for approximately 60 minutes with time for questions. Everyone has automatically been placed on mute upon entry into the webinar. Only our panelists will be unmuted throughout the presentation. Therefore, if you have a question, please just go ahead and utilize either the Q&A panel or the chat panel. Both of those functions can be found in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. And you can feel free to utilize either of those to submit questions or just general comments for our presenter. And we'll pause throughout the presentation to answer questions as they come in. If we don't have enough time to get through all of your questions before the end of the presentation, we have a recording, so we'll try to respond to as many questions as possible via email within the next few days. Just know that our webinar today is being recorded. The recording and the slides will be made available to all registrants, and that will be posted to the National TA Center's temporary website. And a link to this website will be provided at the end of today's presentation, and it'll also appear periodically in the chat box along the right-hand side of your screen. So you can use that URL to access the recording of this webinar later this week, or you can access any of our previously recorded webinars as well. Can you go to the next slide for me, Felicia? Thank you. So today's webinar is one of a number of webinars being offered by the National Student Attendance Engagement and Success Center during 2018. This National Technical Assistance Center was launched in 2016 and is funded by the Department of Education's Office of Safe and Healthy Students. The mission of the center is to disseminate evidence-based practices and build and facilitate communities of practice to help students attend every day, be engaged in school, and succeed academically so that they graduate high school prepared for college, career, and civic life. The two communities of practice referred to in the center's mission are focused on the 30 national My Brother's Keeper Success Mentor sites and the many School Improvement Grant and School Improvement Grant eligible schools throughout the country that are working to implement early warning system programs to address chronic absenteeism. Unfortunately, we've run into several unanticipated delays in launching our formal Technical Assistance Center website, but we are pleased to announce that we anticipate that site going live later this month, hopefully before the start of June, but we're in the final stages of receiving approval for all of our content for the website, so that should be up and running very soon. For the time being, as I mentioned, we're using this temporary URL, which you'll see at the bottom of this slide, where we're housing all of our content and events for the time being. So today's webinar is being presented by Felicia Walker. Felicia is a school and student support services facilitator and early warning systems expert at the Everyone Graduates Center at Johns Hopkins University's School of Education. Felicia has almost 20 years of experience in the field of education, primarily in the area of school transformation, early warning systems, and dropout prevention. In her current role, she works with K-12 staff who are developing and implementing multi-tiered systems of support, including early warning systems. Mrs. Walker also provides training and supervision for talent development secondary staff at Johns Hopkins University program and oversees school transformation facilitators at schools across the nation. Felicia's technical assistance includes creating new strategies for supporting the implementation of early warning intervention and monitoring systems to identify and support at-risk students at the state, district, and school level. She's provided technical assistance to numerous school districts across the country. So Felicia, at this point, I'm going to go ahead and pass things over to you, and you can get us started with today's presentation. Oh, Felicia, I think you might be on mute.
Absolutely right. Thank you, Veronica, for that introduction, and thank you to everyone who's joining us today for our webinar on intervention reviews. So what we're going to focus on today is how do you go about reviewing interventions? And this is a very important process that is often not done or is done in stages to access the impact, implementation, and success of intervention reviews. So today we're going to go through just what does that look like and also give you resources that could guide you through the process. So first of all, we're going to talk about what does the process for intervention reviews look like? And what's the why? Why are we doing this? And how do we go about doing it? And I'm going to share two specific examples from schools that I've supported in Tulsa, Oklahoma, as well as Miami, Florida. And then we're going to take a few minutes to look at different types of tracker systems. Many people use different methods to track interventions, so I'm just going to share with you a few of those. And if you have questions or want to know more information about those resources, you'll be provided my email address before the end of the webinar. We're also going to walk through what we call our facilitation guide for those that would be actually facilitating the meeting for an intervention review. We have the actual steps of what you would do before the meeting, during the meeting, and also after the meeting. A very simplistic guide that the facilitator could go through to provide an intervention review. And then last, we're going to look at planning for the facilitation. And also, what data should you be looking at? What does that data look like? And what is that dialogue protocol that's included? So we're going to unpack a lot today, but hopefully you'll enjoy and gather some information that you can definitely take back and use in your current role or position. So first of all, one of the things that you want to consider is, what are the menu of interventions? What interventions do we actually have available, and how are we going about tracking those interventions? Or are we tracking them at all? And one of the ways that you can have a specific way to look at interventions is by using what we call a resource map. And that's where you provide all of your interventions in one place, regardless if they're external or internal. And we've had previous webinars on that, so I encourage you to visit that temporary website that Veronica mentioned, and you can take a look at how do we actually go about creating a resource map. The next thing you want to consider is, what happens when it doesn't work? When someone doesn't follow through, do you already have a process to actually know before the end of a semester or the end of a quarter? And what about if the intervention doesn't work at all? How do we know whether it's making impact? How do we know if it's making the student more successful? So these are things that you always want to consider first when you're thinking about why or how would I go about doing an intervention review. So for this webinar and for this intervention review process, we're going to talk about how do you go about using ABC data, which stands for attendance, behavior, and course performance data, and how does that process work? So when you're building a reflective practice into your work with interventions, one of the best ways to monitor and improve interventions is by doing the steps involved. And you'll see that there's 3 A's. The first one is the access. You have to have access or collect data on the intervention in order for you to be able to do an intervention review. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to analyze, evaluate the intervention's effectiveness, and if needed, change or modify the practice or the intervention. And then you're going to repeat the process of actually doing that action. And you're going to assign the intervention, and then you're going to track to see if it works. So another way to look at this is, once you collect and track your intervention data information, you want to plan to analyze that information. And part of that analyzing also includes sharing. So when you get all of your information and you look at the different charts and graphs that I'm going to be showing to you later, you want to be able to have a method of how will you disseminate and share this information with the leadership team, with the RTI team, with your SAT team, or with your SST team, or with those people who are actually part of deciding those interventions that you assign to students. And then sometimes you may have to revise, modify, or edit the interventions if they're not proving to be effective. And if they are proving to be effective, then you want to continue doing those types of interventions. So let's take a look a little closer at the steps in the actual process. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to actually compile the intervention information. Some people will use Google Docs. Some people will use an Excel spreadsheet. Some schools and districts have a part of their actual dashboard, their EWS dashboard, where they house this intervention information. So what you see here is just an example of what compiling that intervention information can look like. And there's two different examples here. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to analyze. And part of that analysis is looking at what are the most common interventions, who are the most common point persons or champions, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. And also, what was the indicator of focus? Did the intervention align with the indicator of focus? Whatever area the student was off track or posing problems to be or challenges to be off track, did the actual intervention we assigned to that student align with the focus? And then you also want to always note and share the success of students in the different interventions, because sometimes those same interventions can be used over and over again for different students who are struggling with the same challenges or barriers. And then lastly, you want to plan an actual meeting where you examine this data, whether that's through teacher teams, RTI, or MTSS meetings, or even with your administration and school leadership. Because what you want to provide is, are the interventions working? Are they making an impact? And what does implementation versus impact look like? So the first example that I'm going to go through to show you what does this information actually look like when we present it in charts and graphs, and what are we actually doing? What questions are we asking? So the first one is from Tulsa, Oklahoma, and their intervention review for this part focused on looking at who their champions were and then looking at the actual interventions. And that topic can vary depending on what it is that you want to measure or what it is that you want to discuss during the meeting. So for this particular example, we're going to look at who the champions were and the interventions. And the way that Tulsa decided to do this was they met with the principal and the administration first and shared the data that was analyzed, talked about the impact of the interventions, talked about the usage of champions. And then after that, they met with their early warning indicator team and did another analysis. And it's always good to share with the leadership team and the principal especially what your findings were before you actually disseminate that information throughout the school, just because they want to be in the know and want to understand and be aware of the information that you're sharing with others. So if you take a look at the screen, here are some examples of the information that was collected through an Excel document and a Google Docs document. And what they did was they used one of the features on Excel that says change into a chart. Very simple. You may have to play around in Excel for it, but that's a whole nother webinar to talk about how to create the graph. But I just wanted to give you an idea of what the graphs actually can look like once you collect the data in a simple process such as Excel. And the next time you're in Excel, just take a look at the tabs. And one of the tabs does say create a graph or chart, and that's where this information was created from. So it's not very difficult at all. So as you can see in the top right-hand corner, they looked at their champions. Who were the people that were being the champions or the point person for most of the interventions that were being assigned? And they wanted to see if there were some people and staff that could be more involved or were overwhelmed and possibly they could use help from other areas or other staff members on their teams. So this was very eye-opening to share with them who was doing what. Because think about it, when you're at a meeting and you're assigning interventions and you're assigning champions, it doesn't always come through who the people are that are doing the majority of the work. And so this was a way for them to look at it, talk about it, and discuss it. The graph on the left side at the top is their indicators of focus. And they were curious to see, after doing this over a period of time, what were the key indicators that most of our students struggled with or had challenges in. And so as you can see across, sometimes students had more than one indicator. So where you see attendance/course performance, that's in situations where their attendance actually impacted their course performance, which resulted in the student being off track in both areas. And then you'll see that the number one was the attendance column at the top. So the majority of their students during this period where they did the intervention review had challenges with attendance. And that last column, schools start to include this because they want to know how many students did we talk about who actually did not need an intervention at that time, but they were put on what we call a watch list. And a watch list for schools is those students who may be exhibiting certain behaviors that teachers notice there's a change in their attendance or their behavior. So they want to talk about the student and ask other staff members how that particular student is doing in their class, just to see, is there a point of concern and should we or do we need to intervene? So during this time, they had actually met about 25 or so of those students who were talked about for more so for prevention instead of intervention. And that's a very important thing to always look at when you're talking about students and their attendance, behavior, and course performance data. And then the last box on the left-hand side talks about what were the actual interventions that we did. And this led to more conversations about the interventions. Were they successful? Were they impactful? Were students seeing change? For example, with the Check and Connects, did we see those students who received that particular intervention change in that indicator of focus? Did they get better? Did they get worse? Is it a student that we still need to discuss maybe during the next couple of months? And then also, it talked about what services do we have that we may not be utilizing enough. For example, teachers stay after for tutoring a lot, and tutoring up here was only 3%. And that could very well be okay, depending on, if you look at the top graph, what their indicator of focus is. So another way to look at this information is, like I mentioned before, did our intervention actually align with the indicator of focus? And because attendance was one that was high here, I believe that having call homes, check and connects, and those personal conferences were good ways to actually address or intervene with those students. The next example looks at an intervention review that was done in Miami, Florida. And what they wanted to do is they wanted to look at the tracking of their interventions, and they performed what we call a quarterly analysis. So they did this each quarter to check and see how their interventions were for students. Were they being impactful? Were they seeing success with different students? And so what you see pictured here is some of the ways that they decided to look at their intervention data. So if you look at the example to the right, it looks at marking period one's average daily attendance data. And one of their interventions for that was having their school transformation facilitator call home. So that's what you're looking at there is the percentage, the ADA percentage, and then what intervention was assigned. And then the bottom one is an example of how they were tracking interventions for a specific student. This is just an example during an actual early warning indicator meeting. And here they note the date of the meeting, what the indicators we're focusing on. A stands for attendance, B stands for behavior. And then they also included what were the teacher comments, what were the challenges that they were having with that student, and what was the actual intervention they assigned, and also the point person. Again, this is something that can easily be done in Google Docs, or it can be done in Excel. So now what I want you to think about is, if this were your school, what would be the plan for your school or your district? What types of intervention data would you be interested in tracking or collecting? So when you look at the first bullet, how would you share with your site team? Who would be the people that you would want to share the information with? Are there multiple teams, or is there just one main team? And then how would you guide this larger group through determining what the next steps would be? So once you have an actual intervention review meeting, you need to think about, what are we going to do next? From this data, what are going to be our next action steps? And so what we've included in here in the next couple of slides is actually a planning template. And this tells you how to prepare for it, who needs to participate, and what preparation needs to go into preparing the data for the meeting. And it also gives you an example of a facilitation tool that's used and was used in the previous two examples that I shared from Tulsa and Miami. And then you also need to decide, how frequently do we need to do interventions? What would make sense for us in our school or district? And again, for the next steps component, why are we doing this and what do we want to accomplish next? What would you hope to see come out of this meeting for your school? So those are some things that you would need to consider before embarking on an actual intervention review. So here is a process for intervention reviews. First, you want to make sure that you're using the data to drive your intervention dialogue. So the ones that you saw before talked about the student, the intervention, the process for review, and then here's some sample questions that could come up in the actual dialogue as we're talking about interventions. Do our interventions align to the off-track indicator? Do we apply a variety of interventions at the Tier 2 or group level and Tier 3 individual levels? Sometimes when we're having meetings and we're assigning interventions, we tend to stick to the most common responses or the interventions that we do the most. And so doing an intervention review gives you a chance to actually review those interventions to see, are we using a variety of interventions that we have available to us? And then lastly, you may need to do revisions and revise or simplify those interventions, or for those that are not being used that often, you may want to increase the engagement and the usage of those actual interventions. And then part of your next steps could be, you want to look at the bigger picture, and that would be looking at your Tier 1 interventions. Things that you do such as initiatives and different campaigns such as attendance campaigns, are they being impactful, or are we doing them because we always do them around this time of year or that time of year? So that's another way to look at the big picture, look at your Tier 1 interventions for your whole school and seeing if they are being impactful. So I'm not going to go through each bullet point for the facilitator tips, but here is a guide that was used in the previous intervention reviews that I shared with you from Tulsa and Miami, where it gives you an actual blueprint or a template to use when you're preparing for the intervention review, when you're actually at the meeting, and also what can be done after the meeting has been completed. So for a meeting session, it usually takes approximately 1 to 1.5 hours. And it should be revisited. Usually we say every quarter, if possible. Some schools can only do it each semester. And some schools who have really gotten good at it will actually do one each month. And then what you want to do is decide, who am I going to actually meet with? Is it going to be the teacher team? Am I going to meet in smaller groups? Or some other variation based on the time constraints and the familiarity with the data that you're going to be talking about. And what you want to do is, before the meeting, and I'll just go through some of these, you want to gather the materials that you need, and you'll see those listed out when we get to the actual example. You want to chart the frequency of the interventions used, identify the school's biggest needs, and you can do that, like I said before, using Excel or Google Docs. And then you want to share a general overview of the meeting with participants and ask them to provide any documentation relevant to a student's progress. So they're going to know beforehand what students you previously talked about and what interventions will you be discussing. And at the meeting, we always advise people to establish the meeting norms, and that involves reviewing the goals and outcomes, and then also explaining the necessity of reflecting on intervention so everyone can understand why and how we're going to go about doing this. And once each group has completed an intervention review, the facilitator can actually go to what we're going to talk about in next steps. I'm going to show you actually what that looks like and what questions to consider when you're talking about completing the next steps. And so one thing that we encourage is that all the participants who participate in the meeting are fully engaged, and they can integrate new information if there's any information to share at that time, and also utilize what's been learned and look at the impact that it has made. And usually that's measured a lot by the student's success. Are they getting better in that indicator area, whether it's attendance, behavior, or course performance? So just looking at before the meeting, gathering the materials, charting the frequency use. So these are things that you want to make sure are happening in order for you to successfully have an intervention review meeting. Just give you a few minutes to look that over. And here is an example from an early warning indicator meeting. And it's the document that a school uses to record their actual interventions. And this is what's used to create the graphs that were shared with you earlier through the Excel document. So there's information up here that looks at the student's primary concerns, the date that we discussed the student, the actual indicator that was addressed, the interventions that were assigned, and most of the time there's more than one intervention depending on the area of focus. And then there's also the point person. And through the sharing and reflecting on the interventions, usually we try to ask schools to include an update column. Do you have any new information about the student that we talked about? Do you have any changes in the student's behavior that we should be aware of and consider if we should have to talk about this student again? So again, here's an example of an Excel spreadsheet that would create the graph that I shared earlier. And it's also an easy way to disseminate the information to other people who may not be at the meeting, but share that student throughout the day so they can know what interventions are being assigned to that student. This here is another example of a school's tracking system of what they used. Again, it's in an Excel document set up similar to the last, but it goes into if students have been withdrawn or if they're on the watch list, which means that they have done the intervention, it worked, and that's awesome. So we can focus on that student maybe next semester to make sure that that student is still achieving success. But this is just another example of a way to track the interventions and to have that data to gather to create those charts and graphs before you actually have the intervention review meeting. And this is another example of the types of graphs that can be created from using those two previously shared spreadsheets. And also, there's a way for you to create pivot tables in Excel that you may want to look into as well. But you have the ability to focus on so many different things when you're conducting an intervention review. So this one, some of them focused on types of intervention used. Some of them focused on what percentage of the ABCs did we focus on. And then also, what were the school level interventions that we used the most? And for this example, it was home contact, where they used that percentage the most. So the idea is to give you an example of the different areas of focus for an intervention review. It doesn't just have to be on what interventions we use, but we also want to look at what types of interventions were used, what focuses did we have, and make sure that that aligns with the data that we have for the interventions. And here are more examples. Some schools were focused on how often are interventions occurring. Do we move too fast when we try to gauge the impact? Or should we start to spend more time as we're assigning the interventions? So some interventions were done only once, the majority of them. Some were done as needed, and some were done weekly. So this is a way to gauge and look at, out of all the interventions that you're assigning, how often are they being done? Again, looking at the intervention champions, who was the person or people or organization responsible for the majority of the interventions that we assign to students? And again, this is a good way to kind of see, are we overutilizing certain staff or certain organizations where the workload could be spread out? So it starts to generate a lot of different questions and aha moments at times. And then the graph at the bottom talks about what type of interventions were used for which early warning indicator. And it starts to say, did it make sense for, I'll use the first example, where they have the majority of green, 57%. The actual EWI was related to academics. So they used intervention that was related to their coursework, which made sense. Sometimes it looks like the behavior was impacting the academics, so they had to use a behavior intervention to address the academic concern that that student was having. One interesting one is the second bar that you see. It was about social, like what were the social challenges and barriers that students were having, and all of those interventions were associated with behavior. Just give you a few minutes to look those over. And again, all of these were created by schools just utilizing the Excel spreadsheet or a Google Doc. So now, once you've created all of those graphs and you have the data and you're ready to go, what actually is going to happen at the meeting? You want to share the documents that you created and provide reasoning for those documents. Why did you focus on which graphs, or why did you focus on which particular data points? And then you want to provide the group with reflection questions that you'll see from the next few slides, just so you can start the dialogue about the intervention review and about the interventions that were assigned. You may need to assign a timekeeper recorder to keep the meeting on schedule, and always remind participants of the meeting norms and the goals of the meeting. So what we're going to take a look at next, over the next couple of slides, are screenshots of what does it actually look like when you're having that dialogue? What kind of questions are you actually focusing on? So the following questions, they're designed to help the facilitator guide the review of the interventions, and it also looks at the trackers that you use to prepare the information. So here, and I'll just highlight a couple of these or go through a couple of these questions. One of the first questions that are usually asked in an intervention review as you start to look at the graphs and look at the data and have these conversations are, what are the 3 most common student barriers? And this conversation can lead to what next steps can we do to address those barriers. And then you also look at what are the top 5 people students are most referred to. You want to make sure that everyone is contributing to the intervention process, so you don't want to overwhelm anyone by always selecting this particular teacher or that particular coach or that particular administrator. You want to make sure that everybody's contributing to implementing the intervention so no one gets burned out. What are the 5 most prescribed interventions? And the reason why this is important is because you want to see, are they making a difference? Are they giving impact? Is it positive outcomes? Are the students improving? Are they being more successful? And then do the interventions match the need that you're seeing? And are students in any interventions improving more than others? So I shared this to just share some of the questions that could start the dialogue with the teams that you're meeting with, whether it be an admit team, a teacher team, or MTSS team. But these are the kind of questions that you want to look at when you start to track the data, have these intervention review meetings, and then think about what could next steps possibly be. So I guess I'll take a pause here to ask if anyone has any questions that you want to type in the box, or if the host has any questions so far.
We haven't had any questions in, but certainly if anyone on the webinar would like to submit a question or comment, please go ahead and use that chat function on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, or you can use the Q&A function. Either one is perfectly fine. Just be sure to select all participants in the, or all panelists rather, in the send to drop-down menu. That way we'll be sure to get that.
Okay. I'll go ahead and keep going while you guys are thinking of your questions or typing them in the box. So after the meeting, what you're going to be looking at is you want to collect the responses to the data points that you were discussed. You want to review the notes and next steps provided that may include you following up with other staff members or other people that was at the meeting, and just determine what next steps need to be made as it relates to what the data showed and how impactful the interventions were or were not. And this is where you may have to modify some interventions, edit or change the frequency of the interventions. So this gives you a time to debrief and look at the notes and the responses to the questions so you can say, what might our next steps look like? And when you're thinking about coming up or developing those next steps, here are a few questions that can help you along that process. And if you have time, sometimes this is actually discussed at the intervention review meeting, or it may be discussed as a follow-up after everyone's had time to kind of absorb and review the charts and graphs that were provided. And this is also when you would want to have, if you have available, a resource map to see if your resources need to be modified and also which resources worked well and you may want to continue. So some of those next step questions would be, what can we change as a group? Do we want to change the way we're doing our meetings where we talk about interventions? What do we feel like we need help with? Because sometimes you'll notice through the data that you have a lot of intervention, you have a lot of challenges with behavior. But when you think about your interventions list for behavior interventions, you don't have that many. So are there other people or internally and externally that could possibly help us with providing additional interventions for our students? And then some other reflection questions could be, do the students find the interventions useful? I'm a big component for, or supporter, should I say, of student voice. So I think that just knowing how students feel about the interventions being assigned is very helpful as well. Was the intervention worth the time and the effort to implement? Sometimes we'll spend time implementing certain interventions and you won't see any sort of impact or positive results. So we wouldn't want to continue to do those interventions again. Some other questions would be, what were the learning outcomes? Were they achieved? And maybe how can teacher teams better utilize the variety of interventions that we have? Maybe all teachers aren't aware of those interventions because they haven't dealt with a particular student. How might we get those interventions to the whole school so they are aware of what we have on our menu of interventions? So what I've just gone through is an overview of an intervention review process. And what I want you to consider and take away is, what do we do about it? So now that we've had this information, what are we going to focus on? What are we going to do about it? And here are a few things to consider when thinking of putting the next steps into actions. We know our students have challenges and need support. We know who those kids are. What are we going to do about it? So these are some ideas and thoughts that have evolved, or should I say also deepened, students and teachers' awareness of what interventions are, and also at the administration level, what we should do about those. So the first bullet says create a tiered intervention system that has resources available to students. And that's just saying, because we all know that we're doing interventions, but do I know, am I aware of what interventions are wholly available and readily available in my district and my school? Make data regularly available to school staff. Some school staff are privy to certain data information and data points that other staff members aren't. And so just having those conversations about the data and the impact of the interventions is useful and helpful. And then creating structures to regularly monitor this data. Once you have the interventions and you know what they are and you're doing those interventions, what's the result of those interventions? Should we continue to do them? And some places where that can happen is through leadership team meetings, or just teacher team meetings, or early warning indicator meetings. You may call them RTI meetings or MTSS meetings, or a variety of other meetings. And here is the actual draft of what the facilitator would use to kind of jot down the notes during the meeting. And again, this is just a snapshot of something that can be emailed to you electronically to give you a better visibility and an understanding of what the different types of questions are. And you may not have to ask each one of the questions that are in each block, but this just gives you an idea, because what we want to do is start the dialogue when we have those graphs and charts in front of us, and when we have that intervention review data. We want people to be thinking along these lines, which is why we provide these examples of questions to start that conversation and thought points.
Felicia, we have a couple questions that come in.
Okay.
The first one is, who is responsible for entering data? For example, how is data integrity maintained?
Usually that role can vary. In most situations, there's a facilitator at the meeting, or if the facilitator is not the person entering the data, it's usually the assigned person that's the recorder. And so they're entering the data into, like I said, either a Google document or an Excel spreadsheet, or actually a school's EWS dashboard, if they have that capability to enter interventions there. And that person is usually right there at the meeting. And usually what happens is the facilitator reviews the information if it's not him or her, themselves putting it in. They'll review the information. And usually when it's sent out to other staff member, let's say a teacher that couldn't make the meeting or a teacher that has a student and wasn't able to come to the meeting, they usually receive it as a read-only document. So there can't be any changes made or modifications to it without the facilitator or the record keeper, the recorder, doing that.
And then, thank you. And then the next question is, can you speak to the importance of root cause analysis in the selection of the interventions? I'm wondering why it's not included in the data spreadsheet.
Well, depending on if schools and districts are able to determine what that root cause is, sometimes they don't have enough information at these meetings to make that, to make that judgment or to know exactly what the root cause of the students' challenges or barriers are. And if that information is available, I would strongly suggest adding it to the spreadsheet, because that is very important when you look at how to address a student's challenge or barrier. Because if you know the root cause, a lot of times you can prevent that challenge or barrier from happening again, because you can get to the root cause of that issue. So I'm not against at all adding that to a spreadsheet if you know what the root cause is, adding a column specifically called root cause.
Great, thank you.
No problem. And then what you see on the screen there was just an example of additional questions that you can ask during the intervention review. And again, next steps, reflection questions is what I have highlighted and what I talked about on previous slides. So collectively, this template is about 4 to 5 pages, and you would just continuously go through and have the discussion with your data there and your graphs and charts. And depending on what the information is telling you and how the facilitator wants to facilitate the meeting, they would pull out specific questions that they would focus on and ask to those that are participating. And I just wanted to share with you and end with, through some of the impacts that were had from intervention review meetings were listed here. If we had not taken the time to measure and monitor our effectiveness, the impact and purpose of our interventions, we probably would have not been able to achieve the success that we did. And this also helped us to be more supportive of each other and our team when we were having conversations about champions and interventions and the impact they were having on our students. So I just pulled out a couple of examples of positive impact. Average daily attendance at one school for the year went up to 84%, where it started at 69%. And the staff there felt like having the quarterly intervention reviews helped them to address the attendance interventions and sometimes beef them up or modify them to get the results that they were able to achieve. In another school, discipline referrals decreased by more than 50%. They averaged 23 a month, and it decreased to 11 or less. And lastly, a school had increased to a 95% promotion rate, and they were averaging 87%. And these were results that the staff felt were directly related to them conducting and having intervention reviews. So the impact is very positive, and schools, once they start to do the process, they actually enjoy it and look forward to what the data is going to tell them through those charts and graphs and how the conversations are going to help them prepare for the next steps. Some of the tools that I share with you by name are Intervention Review Facilitator Guide and the sample analysis from other schools. If you're interested in receiving either or both of these documents, you can email me at f as in Frank Walker at jhu.edu, which is the email address that's displayed on the slide. And I wanted to make that option available to you because as we're going through the slides, some of the questions were not legible, which is why I tried to pull some of them out and talk about them. But if you're interested in receiving the resources that were shared, please do not hesitate to email me at the email address that's shared there. And I just want to thank you for your time and participating in the webinar. And again, if you have any questions, please type them in. If you would like samples of the documents or more information, again, you can email me at the email address displayed.
Felicia, we did have another question come in.
Okay.
What were the grade levels for the sample schools?
The schools in Tulsa were middle schools, and the school in Miami were high school.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody, and thank you to Felicia for all of that really helpful and informative information. We hope you all enjoyed the presentation, and I want to just remind everyone that this webinar and all of our previous webinar recordings are available at our temporary website, and Dantel has just posted the URL for that website in the chat box. So just be on the lookout for that to be posted on the website within the next few days if you're interested in viewing the recording or downloading the PowerPoint slides. Also, please just keep an eye out for the announcement about our website launch, which should be coming here within the next couple of weeks. With that, I again want to thank everybody for participating today, and we hope to see you again on a future webinar. Have a good day, everyone.